Hi there, and welcome to our 10th Business Book Live on LinkedIn. So, today we're going to be talking about Fortitude by Bruce Daisley. So, as always, please do let us know where you're joining from if you're watching, and please feel free to comment or ask questions during the session. So, I'm joined by Rebecca and Gill, and we're missing Alison this time, unfortunately. So, welcome, ladies.
Morning.
Do you want to just do a quick intro? So, Gill?
Yeah. Well, I'm an executive coach and I've been part of the Business Book Club for all 10 as well. Really enjoyed reading this book.
Yeah, okay, and Rebecca?
Yeah, hi. So my name is Rebecca Wilson, and I've been here since the beginning too. So yeah, really enjoyed the book. I normally help clients with spreadsheets and automations, but I'm very, very close to giving birth to a baby. I'm a week and a half away from my due date, so I'm on maternity leave now.
Yeah. No, we're really pleased that you could join us today. So thank you. Squeeze it in. Yeah, last nice piece of work, hopefully.
Yes.
Workish. Okay, so resilience. So the kind of the blurb says he takes the notion of resilience apart, explains how it really works, and puts forward a new program for building self-confidence and tenacity. So I thought it would be useful to just start with general view on the word resilience, really, and how the book frames it or reframes it. So Gill, do you want to say a couple of things about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's much overused, the word, personally. It gets used as a catch-all. I also think a lot of companies got very into running resilience training, which I always had mixed feelings about. Because I often felt it was partly, well, if we give them resilience training, then we can lean on them a bit more toughly or hardly. So I always had mixed views on the word. Yes, we do need to have, I think the word he uses, fortitude. But yes, so I've always seen it as a word really surrounded by emotion.
Yeah, okay. Rebecca?
Yeah, so I thought it was interesting how he talked about how the kind of corporate world has taken it and said, this word is now a tick box exercise. You aren't resilient, you do the training, and then you are resilient. And it's your fault if you're not because you've had the training. And it makes it very much about, kind of condensing it down just to kind of things that you should be able to manage on your own. A learnable thing. It doesn't take into account any kind of environmental factors or any kind of how your inner voice talks to you or anything else. And so I thought it was really interesting. And I hadn't really, before reading this book, I hadn't really thought about it at all. I mean, obviously, we all know resilience is a big, it's becoming less so, but it was certainly very big a few years ago, wasn't it? And I guess it still is. But, it's interesting that he kind of is almost saying, I'm not having it. I'm not having it that we're using this word and that we're kind of blaming individuals for being able to cope or not. And it does make you think that is kind of what the corporate world is forced to do. They always kind of boil things down into boxes that can be ticked. And if there's not a box that can be ticked, I don't like it. And so any kind of idea of a journey or any kind of idea of environment or any kind of idea of kind of get onto the kind of pillars, etc., and just are not tolerated. And so it's interesting. And it was interesting the things that he likened it to as well. So it was quite a kind of, hadn't thought about this concept before. He kind of mentioned it, and I'm not sure whether I love the word fortitude, but I certainly agree with his analysis on the word resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shame that Alison couldn't be here actually because her specialism is resilience, isn't it? So it would have been nice to hear her view. But I know I've said to her before, similar to you, Gill, that I don't really like the word resilience. It always kind of, to me, feels like how much can you take before you break or something like that. But it is good the way that he's reframed it. So one of the things that I liked, which I just mentioned, was he said here, when in the history of time has anyone calmed down by simply being told to calm down? And the same way with resilience, you're not going to become more resilient just because you're being told to. So I thought that was interesting as well. So who should read Fortitude? So Gill, any views on that?
I actually think it's got a lot of useful things in there for everybody at any time, actually. And you can actually take different bits because it's all in useful chapters. at different times. So I felt it had a lot of uses, and also it's because it's these lovely sections. You could read the intro, then pick off the relevant section to you.
Yeah.
And certainly I think it's useful for coaches to read. Anybody dealing with people who are dealing with difficulties or trauma, I think
Yeah.
it's useful. But I think, yeah, it is a general population book. Is the name Fortitude? It's quite a quaint name, really. But I guess it broadens it out from being just resilience.
Yeah. Yeah. Rebecca, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I agree, all of the above, but I'd also say the way that he kind of, it feels like you could do a kind of after the event, I need to become more resilient or become more fortuitous,
Yeah. Whatever.
but also my brain is obviously now wired. I'm about to become a new mum. It made me think about what are the things that we can put into people's lives at a young age to encourage them to build this trait. So the book talks a lot about sort of people who view the world this way have more fortitude than people who view the world that way. In various different ways with different characteristics, different traits. And of course, it made me think about, what experiences do we want to kind of encourage as parents for our children? How do we want to help them reframe when something bad happens? How do we want them to, when we start talking about the 3 pillars, how can we kind of encourage that? So for me, it felt like there was kind of a 3-pronged people who could read it, the kind of either you've gone through trauma or you're helping people, so you're a coach or something like that, to understand yourself better. So where am I good at these things and where am I not good at these things? I'm not dealing with trauma. I haven't had to deal with trauma, thank goodness. And then finally, kind of how can we use what we learned to kind of help people that we care about and kind of encourage them to be developing all the wonderful traits that can, it does feel like you can help set people up to think more in that way and to have more of that view of the world. It feels like 90% of it is how you perceive the world, and you can obviously help shape people's perceptions by telling them stories, developing their experiences, helping them see different sides of it and that kind of thing. So for me, that's just because of the time of my life and that I'm at, that's kind of where my brain went to.
Yeah, that's good. I was thinking also about kind of teachers and those in education and parents like you. So he was talking about when he was growing up in the 80s that he can't recall ever being having resilience talked about, and actually it's a much more recent thing.
Yeah.
But then the examples of all of the kids that went through the exam process during COVID and haven't had proper exams essentially, and even now with there's lots of universities that are not marking exam papers, so these young people are never going to know if they've actually passed their degree, and it's just they're being told they need to be resilient, but actually what does that mean for them? So yeah, it's very interesting. Okay, so we've picked 3 sections of the book. So Gill, you were going to start with identity.
Yes, identity was a really interesting one. So sort of abstract. He talks about how people perceive themselves and how they really, in a way, they talk to themselves about what they do and who they are. And one thing, the example that he used was this robust sense of self, he called it. And he used examples of bomb disposal experts, 2 different people. And I just think of that as being one of the scariest jobs in the world. Do it at height. For me, that would probably be the scariest job in the world. But it's talking about how they approach it, and the different sense of self. 2 different bomb disposal experts, and they had a different sense of self, but how that enabled them to do their job by just thinking either about, well, I just do this bit, then we should be there, either taking just in stages or thinking, what can I do to, very factual way to make this safe. And it was really about how they perceive themselves. It's also talking about how where it derives from, which fits in what Rebecca's saying, it very much derives from the social experience and activity. We're not born with this sense of self. It comes from parents, or I would say the carers around us, and the stories they give us about who we are and where we've come from. You know, well, you're good at swimming, you've always done well at, you know, creative writing, these sorts of things. Well, you get that from your Auntie Sarah. But it's really, really important, because when he talks at the beginning about why people succeed, it's often, you know, people say, well, they've overcome trauma, that's why they're an Olympic gold medalist. But it's actually unpicking that to say you could be one of these children who've had a high ACE score, i.e. a traumatic childhood, but that doesn't mean to have to tie you to poor life outcomes. You know, and I actually did the ACE. I looked at it and decided I actually scored quite highly, and I think I can relate to that. Because really what it's saying is, how do you perceive yourself? And one thing, and it's the narrative, you don't have to define yourself through that trauma. And if you think about, there are those people in lives who do like to define themselves through their trauma. But it's actually saying we can choose it. We can choose a different narrative. And again, that's through if we think about other reading we've done and my knowledge, the language we choose to describe ourselves and the trauma, the lessons we take from it. And I was just thinking about it. It's so that you're not less than. It's also knowing you're not the only one going through it. And I often use that phrase with coaching. I say, well, you're not alone. Because it is actually, how can I build a narrative which isn't all about the trauma, but it is about who I am and what I can do. And I used to do some work, volunteer in a women's refuge, and I did one session on strength, and we had post-it notes, and I made them write things out. My name is, and I'm good at. They had to put 3 things they were good at, you know, skills, work skills, and they had to pin it, stick it on themselves, and then we had to get them to say it. I got them to say it out loud. Now, what was interesting, you always have volunteers in the group with you when you're running sessions like that to help the group members. Some of them maybe struggle with various things. And even some of the volunteers struggled with saying, my name is, and I'm good at. Really, really powerful. Yet to recover, they really need that strong sense of self. And he also then talks about the team sense of self. We start to look on that, building a team identity. And looking at I guess, he looks at lots of stories where teams or groups of people haven't worked well, when they have worked well, but really draws on the work of Matthew Syed, who talks a lot about why did Homo sapiens win out after Neanderthals? Neanderthals had the bigger brain. They were bigger, they were taller. What made it was the Homo sapiens were more social, so they had group learning. So their learning built on one another because they're able to forge relationships and create a group identity. So there's 2 different sorts. It's one is the group as the individual sense of identity, and the other one is the group identity. And sure, you can have groups that do things which aren't for good. But if we look about our evolution, that group sense of identity and other places, recovery from 9/11, how the police forces recovered, it's because they had each other to talk to. People who were left on their own and solo did not fare as well, because we are social beings. So I found this whole idea of identity being integral to fortitude just really very, very, I guess, significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote down the thing from that chapter was where it says trauma needs to become your experience, not your identity, and I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah. And I actually thought, current day one, I thought poor old Prince Harry, I think he's stuck in trauma. It's become his identity.
Yeah.
And that's really not helpful nor healthy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Rebecca, any thoughts on what Gill's just been saying?
Yes, I thought that what was interesting for me and kind of reminded me of a bit of a journey that I went on is this idea that your identity is almost the story you tell yourself about who you are, or the story you believe about who you are, and therefore you can choose to change it, because you can choose to tell yourself a different story. And this kind of idea of it being dangerous to kind of pin your identity to either negative things, so trauma, or to pin it to something that can change. For example, when I lived down in London and had a big corporate career, who I was a director. I was someone who managed multiple teams across multiple sites. I was important, and all the rest of it. And then when I chose to move back home to Scotland, I moved in with my parents for a short time, so I could find a property. And it really kind of made me think, I'm now someone who doesn't have a job. I'm someone who lives with my parents, at 30, whatever I was, etc. And kind of then I was able to reframe that identity and say, well, actually, how incredibly lucky am I to afford to not have a job? How incredibly lucky am I to be able to spend this much time with my parents? I'm someone who, is helping my parents rather than I'm someone who's living with my parents. And so I thought that idea of recognizing that you can make a choice about how you reframe your identity and how you can reframe it around your values rather than things you do or things that's happened to you. So I'm a kind person rather than I'm a dentist or I'm a person who's had trauma or I'm a what have you. I thought that was a really helpful way of helping you cope and way of helping you pre-cope, right? To kind of prepare yourself from anything else. Like, I will always have this value. So I can always identify with that, whereas my job might change. I don't want to be a victim, etc. I thought that was a really interesting idea. And like I say, kind of hit home from a personal experience.
Yeah, that's really good. And I guess you could use that in a coaching environment as well, couldn't you, Jill? By talking to people about that kind of reframing of yourself.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, actually. And two things to do is to write it down and to say it out loud.
Yeah.
Because it's the words and language we choose, as we know, really starts to define our experience. You get into this loop. And, a badge, a Post-it note, even walk around the house with a Post-it note attached to yourself as well.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. So we're going to move on now to control. So Rebecca, you were going to talk a bit about this one.
Yeah, so control is kind of when he's looking at Fortitude, he has this kind of idea of three pillars. One is identity, one is control, and one is community, which we'll kind of come on to. And the idea of control is kind of your feeling empowered to choose, your ability to kind of make decisions about what's happening in your own life. And essentially the kind of the argument or the what he puts forward is the more you feel in control, the more kind of positive ripples that has. And he kind of looked through quite a lot of studies and kind of, I've written it all down here, kind of more control leads to self-esteem, empowerment, safeguarding against depression, against loneliness, reduces stress. And he even had one study around it, kind of how having more control leads to greater optimism, because if I feel like I can have control on the environment that I'm in, I'm more optimistic about the outcome. And he cited a study of breast cancer patients who, when they were first diagnosed, were basically asked questions about how optimistic they were, how much they felt like they had some control over the outcome of what was happening. And those who were optimistic and sort of felt they could fight, at the end of the studies, 3/4 of them were still alive, whereas those who had sort of been defeated, sort of felt helpless, only 35% of them were alive. And so it's just this kind of, wow, like the idea that having control can actually have an impact on how your body, fights disease or controls stress or all the rest of it is quite astonishing. And again, it feels like it's something I've experienced, right? When I've had more control at work, I've been happier, healthier, didn't get as many colds, all that kind of stuff. And it talks about how there's lots of different influences on our control through our life, going back to kind of how can we use what we learn. So one is obviously your work environment. So how much you have control over the work. Do you have a say in what tasks you do all day long, or is it just do this task next? Again, that kind of diverges people who have control and don't have control. we also talk about this kind of cyclical control through parenting. So if you're very controlled as a child, you would then tend to more likely, if you're a controlling parent, that your children will be bullies, which is really interesting. And again, that's kind of what lessons can we learn from that. And then the other is your status, which again is perception, right? So how much status do you perceive that you have in society? And those who perceive they have higher status are much less likely to be kind of lonely, much less likely to kind of be powerless, much less likely to be kind of helpless, and again have better health outcomes. And so it feels like there's this kind of unfair, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer kind of thing with control, in the sense of, probably if you're rich, you've probably got a higher, certainly have higher status, you probably have more control of your finances, and you probably have a job where you have more control. So therefore you get richer, right? Because you've got more fortitude and you can handle more and Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, you're more likely to get sick, and then more likely to worry about not having money, and then more, etc., etc. So it's kind of an interesting, what it made me think about is how in society could we empower people to feel they have more control? What could we do that actually might help bridge that gap between the sort of rich and the poor, for want of better terminology? So again, a really interesting concept, and a whole bunch of kind of rabbit holes to go down if you want to. And again, something that kind of really reflected on, yes, when I felt in control, you do feel different, very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking before we were live about, there's so much in this book that you kind of knew that you need to go back, because there are so many stories that you can kind of relate to, and maybe you pass over them, but actually there's a lot in here, isn't there? So Gill, any thoughts on what Rebecca's just been talking about?
No, I think absolutely this thing about control, and also I think that some of it is, for people, it's they don't recognise they have a choice how they feel about things. So it's one of the things in neuroscience, you are not your thoughts. You do have some control about the thoughts that you have. But in order to do that, you need an example, and you need somebody to help you shape a narrative about where they can start taking little tiny bits of control, maybe seemingly in small bits of their life, so they get used to that feeling. Because I think you have to learn it, because I think there's a lot of people who just feel that's the way it is, and this is the way I am, that whole feeling of hopelessness. So is this, where is the locus of control? Is it outside of me, I'm being done to, or can I bring it inside of me so I can do? I mean, I found the one about the disease really interesting as well, because it had some people who didn't take it, whether they took the disease seriously and did things about it, or they didn't take it that seriously, just thought, I'll follow its course. They sort of had three groups. So I thought it was absolutely fascinating about how people went about dealing with it as to their outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And the thing that I thought was really interesting was the spoons analogy. So it was Christine Miserandino, I think that's how you pronounce her name. So, and I've heard this spoons analogy before referred to in kind of autism and things like that. And it's all about your energy. But for her, it was, she had lupus, or has, and her best friend asked her what it was like to have that. So she said the best way to describe it was she grabbed all the spoons in the cafe that they happened to be in and said, this is how my energy is at the start of the day. And then as this happens, all the spoons are disappearing. And she said sometimes you get to a point where you've got no spoons left and you can't continue on that day because there's nothing left. So she's taught herself to have reserve spoons so that she's kind of holding back some energy. So again, like you say, it's that whole control thing, isn't it? So she's got this awful disease condition, but she's actually found a way to try and manage that. And then now it's a really widely used, what's the word? Thing. Yeah, really widely used. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so Gill, we're going to then talk about community.
Yeah, well, I touched a bit on this because it came up with the whole identity thing, which is really this, how do people start to see themselves, looking at the identity side of the community. So the interesting one was the difference between Neanderthal man versus Homo sapiens, and this whole thing that Homo sapiens are capable of community and sociability. And therefore, even though you might have a massive brain, unless you can link up with people and get this almost group learning, so you're building on learning, how can you survive, if you like? And how can you learn to and overcome? So I've come across this before with other things, but also they looked at other aspects like survivors of 9/11. If the people in the police force did really well because they had each other to lean on, individual people who didn't have a community to go back to that was supportive, they could talk to, well, one of them, she actually ended up dying. Her life just fell apart. And she lost everything, and then she died. And it was this idea of the community as well, being able to talk about it. They know that veterans go through when they're out in war, deal with some very, very difficult things. Yet it's that knowing that your colleague has got your back. That whole sense of interdependence being really, really important. And having an identity as a group. I mean, he does look at some examples where groups haven't worked as well, but he also looks at the role of authority as well in that. Somebody big and powerful telling you what to do, because he unpicks the well-known Zimbardo and Milgram experiments as well. Mm-hmm. The role of an authority figure. But it's really remembering that as human beings, we are social beings. And we do know that people have greater life expectancy, they recover from illness better, they recover from other setbacks, and even addictions better if they have this sense of community, with this identity with that community as well. So I found it really interesting. I also found it really interesting the way he unpicked some of the unpublished aspects of Stanley Milgram's work, who tended to skate round the impact of authority figures telling you what to do. But where individuals had a very sense of identity in that, they didn't do what they were being nudged to do. They stuck with what they felt was right. So again, it's this personal sense of identity coming in. So the whole two are interrelated. And but a lot's in it, that chapter, really a lot. And he refers to the work of the trauma specialist, I'll get his name right, Bessel van der Kolk. No, I've read his book, The Body Keeps Score. I've read that, and he goes back to some of the work in there to look about how people relate to things. But actually, to have fortitude, we need a community around us. I think that's a really, really important thing to build on it. And actually, to move forward and build success, we need that community.
Yeah. Brilliant. I liked he referred to things like Alcoholics Anonymous and the kind of support groups and just basically talking about people that can relate to each other, have got that kind of community feel, self-help, much more likely to succeed. So interested to see all of that. So Rebecca, any comments on what Jill's just been talking about?
Yeah, so what I thought was really interesting, so I totally bought the idea, and kind of, makes sense, and all of what you've just said. What it kind of really made me reflect on is a lot of these kind of self-help books make you think, what do I do for me? How do I change me? And what it kind of made me think about in this case, I was like, how do I help others? It's not about a community being there for me, it's about being part of a community, which means giving as much as taking. And it kind of flipped my brain from the kind of selfish, individualistic kind of what can I do to better me by reading this book, to more of an idea of how can we help each other? How can I be involved in communities so that we're all, the sum of the parts is greater than, that, whatever that phrase is. You know what I mean? And I felt that was quite a different slant on a self-help book, if that's not too derogatory for the book, because it's well researched, etc. So I thought that was an interesting idea, and I thought it made me think more about what can I give than what can I take from me, which is very rare in a book of this kind of type. So I thought that was an interesting takeaway.
Really good, and obviously that you helping other people helps you to feel better about yourself anyway, doesn't it? So it reminded me of that thing in Friends where she talks about there's no such thing as a selfless good deed, because you're getting something out of it as well. So yeah, interesting. Okay, so key point to leave with. So Gill, any thoughts on the kind of final thing from the book?
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with the bits that I talked about. It's that self-identity, building that identity that's away from any difficulty you may have had, and building it separate to thinking about what you can be and what you want to be. And the same with a team, I think, or a group of people as well.
Yeah, great. And Rebecca?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd kind of say the main takeaways is kind of two things. One, how can you reframe? So thinking about control, thinking about identity, how can you reframe how you experience your own life or help others experience theirs? And secondly, how can you give? How can you be involved in a community or communities and kind of help them help yourself, sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I think for me, from a personal thing, it was the trauma needs to become your experience, not your identity. I think that was a really good message. So great. Okay, so we are going to be back, but I'm not sure when yet. So Rebecca's off on maternity leave, so we will decide on a book and update LinkedIn as and when. So thank you very much for watching so far, and see you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.